millions of dollars toward his military regime.
And C.I. Barre of Somalia?
Yeah, dictator of Somalia. It's, to me, one of the scariest stories I found in their archives. I was able to recreate this because they dumped 600 boxes of papers in Billy Graham archives. C.I. Barre was had not a likely candidate for Christian right recruitment, called himself a Quranic Marxist. But in the early 80s, the Soviets had abandoned him. There had been a power shift between Somalia and Ethiopia. He was in the market for a new patron. And working through Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa, of course, still in office.
Talk more about Chuck Grassley, who certainly is in the news now, who together with Max Baucus heads the Senate Finance Committee. Baucus, Democrat, Grassley, Republican, very powerful figure, especially around health care right
Indeed. And Grassley's been involved with the organization for quite some time, since the 80s, when he traveled to Somalia to join Barre, C.I. Barre, in prayer to Jesus, and he brought with him a defense contractor named Bill Brehm. And Barre was a kind of a cynical character, as you might expect, for a dictator. He was very clear. He says, I'm willing to pray to Jesus, and here's what I want in return. He says, I want my defense budget doubled. He says, I want meetings for my officials with the Reagan White House, and I want a sort of a hands-off policy while I crack down on some rebels. Doug Coe, the leader of the group, wrote back, in essence, done, done, and done. And when we look at history, so it was. And Barre used those weapons supplied to him, in part by the U.S., to wage a war of almost biblical proportion on his own people, from which Somalia has not recovered to this day. The family doesn't consider that a failure. They consider that God's will for Somalia.
And more about Grassley. And again, we should say this is not just a Republican organization. Democrats are also part of it. In fact, you talk about Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
Praying with them.
I think that's one of the most important aspects of this. I think too often progressives tend to see the Christian right as simply an auxiliary of the Republican Party, whereas the movement, especially through the family, has recognized that you stay in power not by aligning yourself too closely with one faction, but by having lots of friends. So Hillary Clinton, Senator Mark Pryor of Arkansas, who was, of course, instrumental in fighting against the Employee Free Choice Act, which would have made unionization much easier. He explained to me the family's approach to democratic bipartisanship. He said, Jesus didn't come to take sides, he came to take over. That's a Democrat speaking. So Republicans and Democrats working together. Chuck Grassley, a guy who's been involved for such a long time. Grassley was involved with the Somalia Project throughout the 1980s. They recognize that Somalia, of course, is a nation of great strategic importance right there on the Horn of Africa. So even as they are pursuing what they say is a religious agenda, it's also meshing very neatly with a certain kind of agenda of American expansionist power and oil, frankly.
And rarely is the devastation of the failed state of Somalia talked about in terms of its history, that the U.S. for decades supported this dictator, C.I. Barre.
Yeah, exactly. The story for most Americans begins with George Bush very nobly sending over these troops to fight the warlords. It begins with Black Hawk Down, and we don't recognize that it was really, in this, I mean, Somalia is almost a purest case possible of U.S. support for an absolutely murderous regime, in the face of all odds, too. I mean, there's nothing, it seemed, that Barre could do to dissuade the family that he was worthy of support, even to the point of insulting Doug Coe, the leader of the group, who used sad case, the death of his son, wrote to Barre. He said, my son has died today, and as he was dying, he was speaking of you and how important you are. It was a strange, crass move. Barre didn't play along. He said, I never knew your son, but keep the money flowing. And
we're talking to Jeff Sharlet. He's author of The Family, The Secret Fundamentalism at the Heart of American Power. We'll come back to talk about more of the members of the secretive group that some have called one of the most powerful organizations in America. Stay with us.